outside that it's hard to get anywhere. And if anyone braving bare feet, yeah, watch out for the hot sandy bits. My name's Nick Wallis. I'm one of the founders of the Australian Psychedelic Society and its current president. Today we've got a couple of people speaking about a couple of people from different organisations, local organisations that are engaged in psychedelic research and in getting that together and that happening in Australia. And then we'll be having a panel discussion at the end. If you do have any questions that pop up along the way, there's some pen and paper. If you look where I'm pointing here, that's Dean. Dean has pen and paper. Please write questions down and he'll send them up here. Also, just for a little more administrative stuff, we also have a stall set up in the market space alongside Students for Sensible Drug Policy, who have just launched a campaign called Be Heard Not Harmed in support of pill testing. There's a petition down there which has been signed by many people so far. Has anybody signed it that's sitting around here? Yeah, a few people. So if anyone else is interested, it's in the market area, sort of in the middle concentric circle around there somewhere. If you walk around enough circles, you'll reach it eventually. In there, you'll also be able to speak to some people from the organisation about some of the other work that we do that we don't have enough time to talk about today, including our integration circles and integration events in Melbourne. So just for a little background on who we are, if you haven't heard of us, has many people heard of the Australian Psychedelic Society or been to any of our events? Cool. Thank you. Appreciate it. We formed as an incorporated association in early 2017, though there were a lot of other events and other things that led up to that. Our aim is to work with other like-minded groups and individuals to build stronger and more resilient networks among the psychedelic community. And that's not just... When I say that word, I want to make it clear that I'm not just talking about the drug experience itself, but the culture that sort of blooms around that and the long-lasting impact of the psychedelic experience to people. Because there's some people that will only have a psychedelic a handful of times or once, and that's enough to leave whatever mark it happens to leave on them. Since our formation, we've run a number of smaller and larger events around Melbourne for the Melbourne chapter. We also have a Sydney chapter who have been running events, and there have been a couple of smaller events in Adelaide. But if you have any friends in Adelaide who are interested, tell them to get in contact with us. We'd love to see more things happening in Adelaide and other parts of Australia too. We've done things like movie screenings, events on psychedelic science, talking about the sort of nitty-gritty sciencey stuff, workshops and discussion panels. We've also got a fancy marquee, again, you'll find it in the stall, that we took along to the most recent Entheogenesis Australis conference. Hands again, anyone been to an EGA conference? Yeah, it's the same people, isn't it, putting up the hands. So EGA, you'll be able to find out some information again at the stall, and also Jonathan Carmichael will come up and talk a little bit about EGA a bit later as well. We've also done things like made submissions to government inquiries. There were 3 separate inquiries into freedom of religion and speech recently from the Turnbull, the Liberal fiasco, and I think we submitted to 2 of them on basically sort of talking about cognitive liberty. Is anyone familiar with the concept of cognitive liberty? I'm not going to go into it now, but hands again. I'm liking this little bit of, like 3 people. Basically, that you should have the right to do what you wish with your mind. The way that you have the freedom of speech, you should be able to say the words that you want. Similar sort of thing. You should be able to do these things with your mind. Of course, there's also risks attached, and there's like a little asterisk there and a lot of other things to do. But that's, I think, where we're trying to come in and fill some gaps as well by helping to facilitate these discussions offline, because we've seen a lot of this. This world has bloomed because it's because of the online world. Before that, I'm not really sure what happened. I'm not old enough to know what happened. I suppose there was networks of people connecting, maybe using fax machines. I don't know. Just, there were like fax network things that went on in the 80s and things like that. But the internet and social media in particular has changed the way that all of this is being discussed in a big way. So we've also got a newsletter and social media presence, usual stuff for any organisation. You can find lots of information there. about general psychedelic stuff, from science to culture. And I mentioned before that we do integration circles. We've also done breathwork workshops. So that's to provide opportunities for people to talk about their experience among like minds, which sometimes people don't have that opportunity very much. But I think you probably generally, if you're sitting in here, do you feel like you have that opportunity, or do you feel that it's hard to talk about? Hands again. Is it hard to talk about with people if you have a weird experience that is... Okay, a couple of people. Yeah, so it's good. This is a like-minded community here. So there, a lot that has changed in the past 10 years alongside the rise of social media is the explosion of research, particularly using psychedelics as a tool in psychotherapy, and that's what we're going to hear a little bit about shortly. There's also been, though, a number of papers written on a whole bunch of other different topics, and the EGA conference and their YouTube channel is a good place to go and find some of the other topics that in the academic world that are being discussed. So it's not just the sort of medical applications of psychedelics. There's papers about sort of psychedelic economics, psychedelic politics, psychedelic ecological ideas, and literature and all sorts of things. So it's a broad community, is what I'm saying. We've got representatives from all through mainstream life. You've got a lot of different jobs, different people doing different things. We see a lot of that reflected in our community. We see people from all walks of life who are engaged with all sorts of different things. And I guess it's important that we are able to discuss the psychedelic experience and learn from it and not make the same mistakes over and over and over. And it's not just with psychedelics, but other drug issues too, where we can't... Yeah, come sit. This is Martin Williams. We'll do an introduction shortly. I lost my place, so I'm just good. No, that's all right. So today we're going to be hearing about some of the amazing work of organisations like PRISM, Psychedelic Research in Science and Medicine, and the recent announcement of a psilocybin trial at St Vincent's. But we still live in a world, and this is what I was saying before, that psychedelics are prohibited, and for a long time information of safety risks, what to expect, and so on, sat more in... It was almost like an esoteric space. I saw it is sort of what I was getting to before. It was hidden knowledge that people didn't want to talk about because of the fact that it's illegal and you could get in trouble, and people do get in trouble for drug things, as you might have noticed this weekend. The internet changed that. I've gone back over the same thing, and there's no turning that back now. So it's important to start bringing these conversations into the real world, start having these offline, and meeting people and seeing that in the real world, because I think that's how we can start to make the community a little bit more coherent. Than I think I'm frying my head with the hat, actually. Yeah, I'm gonna finish that. I'm gonna introduce Martin, because it's very hot. Martin Williams is the president of Psychedelic Research in Science and Medicine, PRISM, and also vice president of EGA, currently vice president of Entheogenesis Australis, and a researcher who's going to talk to us a bit about the psilocybin trial.
Yeah,
Thank you, Martin.
Sure. All right. Thanks everybody for coming out. It's fantastic to have you here, and thanks for coming to listen to our story, particularly in the heat, which obviously much more comfortable than yesterday, but still a little bit taxing. But lovely to see you all here. Thank you. Can you guys hear me okay? Yep, sweet. Thank you. I'll just sort of riff, because I'm not doing slides or anything, so I hope you don't mind that, but I hope it sort of starts a conversation, and we're very, very happy to take questions at the end. And in fact, the shorter I riff, then the more time I'll have for questions. So let's go with that. I thought I'd just give a little bit of the background, the history to where we're at now. I think the timing of this conversation is pretty much perfect, because we're very much at this sort of right at the nexus of counterculture and mainstream, and I think both of these concepts need to be explored a lot, because clearly we've been counterculture for quite some time now, although the prehistory of psychedelic research and practice was very much within the sort of the mainstream culture. And now we're really finding ourselves in a very exciting stage whereby it looks as if we're pretty much knocking at the door of mainstream. And that's got attendant risks as well as the benefits. So I think we need to be aware of that. And the more we have these kind of conversations, then I think the better we'll all be able to navigate the path forward. So the prehistory to this research effort is Entheogenesis australis, EGA. That was started. It came out of in fact, the Northern Rivers community back around 2002, 2003. And EGA started out by organising conferences every year from 2004 onwards, which brought together people who are interested in the many, many facets of psychedelics, effectively, whether it was plant culture and history, whether it was, ethnobotany, whether it was research, whether it was contemporary art, whether it was the music culture, anything else. So we really brought people in from many, many backgrounds. And over a period of about, let's say, 8 to 9 years, we had conferences every year. We started out in the outdoor space. We had 2 to 3 conferences within Melbourne CBD itself, generally at the Uni of Melbourne. I apologise if you already know this history, so just bear with me for going over it again. But at that time, I think we grew the awareness of psychedelic culture and the potential for psychedelic therapeutic research as well, and clinical practice over that time. And that really sort of culminated in a conference in 2010 when Rick Doblin from the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies came over from the US as our guest. We had a little forum afterwards, and we really felt that in Australia we had the potential to get in start research to try and change things so that we could eventually move towards clinical practice. I hope that that you will, if you don't agree directly, then you at least would be open to the argument that psychedelic psychotherapy has a potential part to play in mental health treatment in Australia and around the world. So I'll sort of start with that as a premise, okay? So I'm very happy to converse over that later, but I'll just sort of take that as more or less something that we probably generally agree upon. I'm happy to say that the research that's been taking place in the meantime has reinforced and supported that contention. So from 2011, we decided to set up a new organisation, PRISM, Psychedelic Research in Science and Medicine, and many of you will be aware of that history because I've spoken about it a couple of times in the last few years here at Rainbow. But at that time, I feel that we were still very much part of the counterculture, and the whole idea of psychedelic medical research and practice was not the sort of thing you would bring up at the dinner table, for example, or with your family, or just in company that you didn't know well. And so very much in the intervening time, so between 2011 and 2016, we had a couple of cracks at getting research proposals put to ethics committees in Australia, both in Melbourne. Both were knocked back, one by the ethics committee itself and the other actually by the university administration, because it just didn't want to be bothered with the risk of promoting psychedelic research, which they actually stated, wrongly I have to say, was promoting illegal activity. It's stated perfectly clearly in the schedules, the Schedule 9, which is the highest level of restriction of psychedelic drugs or drugs generally in Australia, that these drugs can be used in research, in clinical and medical research. But that was overlooked by the university at that time. I'm happy to name and shame, it was Deakin University in Victoria. I hope they will live to regret the error and their lack of wisdom in that decision. But really things have come around, and I feel that I've sort of likened it from time to time as sort of starting to ride the crest of a wave, which is obviously has its origins in other places. So like no wave suddenly crashes on the shores of Australia without having started somewhere else. And so we are the great beneficiaries of the preliminary steps that have been happening over quite a long period of time. Primarily in the US, but also significantly in Switzerland, in Israel to a degree, in the UK and Canada in particular. And so what that has really done in the meantime has brought around the public discourse, the conversation, so that psychedelics gradually, but increasingly now, have been demystified and destigmatized, as more and more people are just coming to realize that the word psychedelic is simply, it's a very non-threatening, quite innocent word. It just means mind manifesting. And anybody, as I would hope a few people in this audience might have experienced, there's a certain mind manifesting element to the psychedelic experience. And so that's really what it's all about. And that really is the origin also of the therapeutic potential of psychedelics. And so the conversation had been started overseas. Australia, unfortunately, has been rather late to come to the party, but the party seems to be starting now, I'm happy to say. So within the last year, pretty much very much as a consequence of the EGA 2017 conference we had out in sort of near Eildon, northeastern Victoria, that really brought together some clinicians who are working very much at the coalface of mental health practice, and these people are with us. Two of them are with us in the audience today, and also some funding partners who were very interested to support psychedelic medical research because they already had become convinced of the potential. And so it seemed to me that the stars were aligning really quite beautifully. And although our initial interest had been in studying MDMA for post-traumatic stress disorder, and that had been the theme of our first two efforts to get clinical research underway in Australia, it has ended up being psilocybin, which is something that I'm sure is very near and dear to many of us, as an adjunct to psychotherapy for people facing end-of-life anxiety and depression. And so it's been quite an intense year of work to work towards getting the protocol formulated, get that approved by the ethics committee of the hospital in Melbourne where the research was planned to take place. And then we've been moving gradually through the state and then soon to be the federal levels of approval. But I'm happy to say that we're very, very close now. Yeah. So I think the way ahead now is to get the research underway. It's going to take a good couple of years for this to be completed and then communicated. And during that time, I think I can comfortably say that this conversation will continue to evolve so that we're less and less a part of the counterculture and we're more and more representing the mainstream discussion. Now, the mainstreaming of psychedelics has become quite an interesting theme and rather a contentious theme of conversation globally. And I don't know who among us here has actually taken part actively in this conversation, but certainly there are plenty of people who have been involved in the psychedelic space on a number of levels for a number of years who, quite frankly, can't really see the merit in bringing psychedelics into the mainstream. And I think this is a topic that really we ought to be thinking very carefully about because it's something that we can all contribute to. And for those people who do have significant reservations about bringing psychedelics into the more public discourse and ultimately we hope to have them accepted within the sort of the framework of mainstream medicine, I really feel that we need to listen to those voices and very carefully take into consideration what they have to say. And so I would encourage you, particularly right now and during this panel, to please to air any concerns that you might have. One thing that I guess I can say is that mainstreaming is likely to involve, unfortunately, we probably, a lot of us would hate this concept, but it ultimately will involve the commercialization in some way of psychedelic clinical practice. Now, whether that involves some sort of protection of IP, of intellectual property, whether it just simply involves bringing the medical application into the public health system, which I would suggest is a very reasonable and hopefully very palatable way to go forward. Nonetheless, I think that there's plenty of potential for A, psychedelics to have a place, B, for them to be broadly, widely, and very positively adopted in our medical model. And I hope that I hope that the conversation continues in a respectful and positive manner. So I'll leave it at there for the moment. I believe that Melissa will be up in a sec to continue what I've been mentioning and sort of talk about a couple of new developments as well. And I look very much forward to having the conversation as the panel concludes. So thank you very much for your time and your interest.
Before you finish up, Martin, because I know it's a question that was burning around the social media pages when the reporting of the psilocybin trial came out, and people noticed that word synthetic psilocybin, and people got very upset. Can you explain to us what synthetic psilocybin is and why a synthesized version is used in research?
Hands up who's upset by the concept of synthetic psilocybin. Cool. One of the realities of clinical research in humans is that any drug that's given to humans must be produced by according to the framework of what's called good manufacturing practice. And so this is whether we like it or not, this is the standard medical model for having any new drugs approved for clinical use. And unfortunately, harvesting, even cultivation, which is difficult enough, but harvesting, extraction and purification of psilocybin from raw material is not a permissible way to obtain psilocybin for these clinical trials. So that's just the unfortunate reality. So we have to make that compromise at this stage. To use psilocybin, which has been synthesized in a pharmaceutical facility which has been approved. It's an extremely expensive process to have a facility such as a laboratory approved for good manufacturing practice. Ultimately, I guess we would hope, and this is something that I can't really comment on to any great degree right now, is that the current model of mainstreaming psychedelics for medical application will involve legalization and incorporation of the drugs into the framework that already exists. It'll involve the rescheduling of psilocybin and potentially mushrooms, the raw material themselves, which I fervently and deeply hope will take place, into a less restrictive category of regulation. So synthetic psilocybin is chemically identical to psilocybin that would be extracted from the raw material, from the raw biomaterial. One advantage of using synthetic psilocybin is that it can be produced as a pure product which can be dosed accurately, and its therapeutic effects can be characterized very, very carefully and accurately. The raw material, or psilocybin that is extracted and purified from mushrooms, is likely to contain a couple of the precursors or the intermediate compounds in the biosynthesis in the mushroom of psilocybin, and those are called baeocystin and norbaeocystin. And they simply differ from psilocybin in the lack of either one or both of the methyl groups, which are the two little end bits on the psilocybin molecule. But they may or may not have an appreciable neuropharmacological effect that we just can't characterize at this stage. So at this early stage of research, we have no choice. We have to use synthetic psilocybin. But what I would say is that for the people who do have concerns, I would be very interested to know if anybody has ever been in a position to compare the effects of synthetic and naturally extracted psilocybin, let alone synthetic psilocybin and raw or dried mushrooms. Okay, so I'll just put that to you as a little bit of a challenge. I'm fully aware, cognizant and respectful of the issues involved, and I do respect the conversation that's taking place and the concerns that people might have.
Thank you, Martin Williams. If you want to find out more information about what Prism do, the website is prism.org.au, and it's got lots of information on there at the moment about various different research proposals and a lot of local news that's been, because there's been a lot of news about Prism over the past 12 months.
It has indeed.
Yeah.
The announcement. Sorry to keep interrupting and interjecting, but the announcement of the clinical trial at St Vincent's Hospital in Melbourne, St Vincent's Public, was just under 2 weeks ago on Tuesday, the whatever the date was, around the 15th. It was the 15th. And there's been a great deal of very overwhelmingly positive media coverage of all of this, and so I'd like to thank and pay great respect to the collaborators that are with me in the trial, and thank them very much for their involvement, and thanks St Vincent's for making this all possible. So. And also thanks to our funding partners. The other quick plug I'd like to make is just that EGA is continuing to organise conferences, and we're having smaller events for the next year or two until our main conference comes up again in likely to be December 2020. But in 2019, which last week they told me was this year, we will be having an EGA event on the 12th of May is the date that we're considering at the moment. And the theme will be Garden States, and this will be more of a focus again on ethnobotany and plant culture and so on. So I would invite you all to be involved, to come along. You can pick up flyers for EGA, I think here in the space, but also at the APS, the Australian Psychedelic Society market stall, which is down at Y7, I believe, down in the market area. So I would invite you all and strongly encourage you to be involved with EGA. We'd love to have you involved.
I think you can find a mailing list at entheogenesis.org, so you can sign up there, and you'll find the usual social media channels, and YouTube. Their YouTube channel has a number of talks from previous years. I think there's about 100 videos, Ronnie. I'm guessing 80, but it's going up all the time. There's more and more. Check them out, high quality. In fact, we were looking through it, and there's only a couple of other channels that have that many good talks on psychedelics. So that's youtube.com/EntheoTV. Now, Melissa Warner, who is the Executive Officer of Mind Medicine Australia and the co-founder of Australian Psychedelic Society. And Melissa is hosting Professor David Nutt in Melbourne. And David Nutt was infamous for, I think it was 2010, he was the head of the UK government's advisory board on drugs, and he made a comparison between ecstasy use and what he called equicy. He wrote a paper on it and said that actually it's more dangerous to ride horses, equicy, than it was to take ecstasy. He used the statistics, he demonstrated it. It was a bit facetious, but the government weren't happy with that. He also said it was safer than alcohol, which is true. If the facts didn't suit their political agenda, get rid of the facts.
Funnily enough, if he was to say that this week, then he might get a slightly different result. So,
Melissa.
Thank you, Nick, for that lovely introduction, and welcome everyone. It's really nice to see so many people turn up for such an important topic that I'm sure is dear to all our hearts. So we're living during very interesting times when it comes to our understanding of the mind and our awareness of how to grow it and change it and make it more healthy. Neuropharmacology, neuroimaging, and psychology has revealed ways to understand the inner workings of the mind and to better navigate our course individually and perhaps collectively. Wisdom practices like meditation are becoming really commonplace, which I think is really a good sign, because meditation has been shown to increase compassion and emotional awareness in those who practice regularly. And psychedelics are no longer drugs, they are now medicines, which is something really profound. So we're at this time of innovation for the mind and a greater understanding of how to access what we previously could not access, the unconscious mind. and therefore ways to change our lived experience. So who here knows someone who's been affected by mental illness? Yeah, I imagine that really should be everyone, because 45% of Australians will suffer from a mental illness in their lifetime, which is quite a staggering figure. And currently, 1 in 5 have a mental illness. And these statistics are generally rising. So we have this crux point of innovation and understanding, and yet quite a large problem to address. For many people, these experiences can come from the fact that our environments define our lived experience, our reality, our experiences, our storylines. And it can be quite hard to change our storylines. Aldous Huxley said in The Doors of Perception in the 1960s, I believe, that psychedelics were of the plane of art, perpetual creation, and that one day they may find a way out of mental illness for those suffering. And it looks like today that is a statement that is ringing true. Here's a picture of psychedelics in the Wall Street Journal recently, and this phrase you may have heard, which is quite common now, of a psychedelic renaissance, science renaissance. And there's a lot of research to back this up. Psychedelics have been found useful in the treatment of end-of-life anxiety, which is a trial that PRISM is leading at St. Vincent's, also to treat addiction, treatment-resistant depression, and MDMA has reliably been shown to relieve PTSD in sufferers, a treatment that is notoriously difficult to treat PTSD because the window of tolerance for a trauma where you're reactive is so narrow. So this is really profound. I like to use the analogy that psychedelics may allow us to turn off the autopilot in our programs and our learned behaviors. There we go. But what's next? Really, a lot has happened. We have our first psychedelic science trial in Australia. But in terms of treatment and therapy, we really are still at the beginning. Currently, medications that are prescribed generally have to be taken every single day and have an efficacy of a range between 20 to 40%, which is very different from psychedelics, which generally relieve the treatment in 1 to 2 doses. So I'm just going to skip a few slides here. And this is why My Medicine Australia has been born. We're a nexus between academia, government, clinicians, and culture to translate these clinical findings into therapeutic practices and outcomes, which is a really exciting thing to be doing. I think it's something that's really relevant for anyone who attends transformative festivals or has transformative experiences to know the value of context, of set and setting, of how to think about psychedelics in the context of your life. And that's why we'll be launching on the 13th of February at University of Melbourne, and I'd be really happy to see some of these faces along there. David Nutt, if you liked that one-liner about MDMA being as safe as riding a horse, expect a few more. He's quite a funny guy, which is nice. And yeah, we're proud to be a funding partner with PRISM for the trial. And one of our missions is to create a therapist training program in years to come. And these therapists will be able to participate in trials, but also is lined up to be released when MDMA will become a medicine in the USA. So hopefully we'll be able to train some therapists up in line with that. What I think is really important that becomes clear when you look at the research behind psychedelics is the importance of context, the importance of the environment, the way you think about your experience. Because just as much as a psychedelic can be therapeutic, it can hinder you in the wrong environment, in the wrong set and setting. I find it quite interesting to think about how, if we look past this last century, psychedelic use quite likely went right back to ancient Greece, 430 BC, in what was called the Eleusinian Mysteries, where the scholars, leaders, and artists of ancient Greece would meet and go through a 7-day ritual ceremony, which culminated with what is likely to be a chemical that is similar to LSD, derived from wheat? Was it wheat? Yeah. Right. So that's quite interesting. It's quite a long heritage this culture has. And I think that spaces like Rainbow Serpent, like Burning Man, are a sort of a very early stage attempt to create spaces where people can come and have safe experiences. Cicero described, he was a Roman senator, he described the Eleusinian Mysteries as the civilizing aspect of ancient Greek culture. I'm not sure if we can yet describe, as much as I love Rainbow Serpent, I've been coming for 5 years straight, I'm not sure if we can quite call these experiences a civilizing aspect of our culture yet. Which is why I think, perhaps to some degree. But I think that's why it's really important to think about how, as members of this culture that has this long lineage, how are we representing these profound compounds? Robin Carhart-Harris of the Imperial College research team published a paper last year that was titled "The Importance of Context in the Psychedelic Experience." And he described how those who are currently using psychedelics have a certain responsibility in this transition, as Martin spoke about, as we move psychedelics away from the label of drug, away from the label of, technically in Australia, Schedule 9 is a poison, to medicine. How do we show up to that title, to that responsibility? I've been a rule breaker a number of times in my life. And from those experiences, I've learnt there comes a responsibility of being a rule breaker. And that is, you have to be comfortable with everyone else breaking the rules the way you do. You have to break the rules as if they didn't need to be there in the first place. So, with that in mind, I guess, how can we spread that message to the other participants here, to the newcomers? What questions can we ask our friends when they take a psychedelic? What intentions have they set? What goals will they be aiming to reach from the realizations that they have during their experience? If you're going to be having a transformative experience at this festival at some point, I ask you to share your intentions with your friends and those around you. Just a plug for the event. And I think this is important because to help society reconsider their relationship, its relationship with psychedelics, we have to be the exemplars of our own relationship with psychedelics and be the leading example of what that can mean, what that can look like. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Melissa. We've got a few questions that have floated up here. If you did have a question, there is still some pen and paper. If you put your hand up, maybe the pen and paper will come to you. And I've got a few here. Just wanted to say again, for anyone that's come along and is wondering what's going on, we're the Australian Psychedelic Society. We have a stall in the market space area, in the middle somewhere, along with Students for Sensible Drug Policy, who are running their Be Heard Not Harmed campaign to get pill testing not to be such an oppositional thing and just to be a sensible harm reduction strategy that gets implemented. There's a petition there that you can have a look at. There's some books there. And And sitting next to me is Martin Williams, the president of Psychedelic Research in Science and Medicine, PRISM. And you just heard from Melissa Warner from Mind Medicine Australia. Bunch of websites. I'm not going to read them all out for you. If you want to find the websites, they are at, again, flyers at the stall. So if you're interested, go pick them up. There's also people there if you have other things that you want to talk about. We're always up for a chat. So a couple of questions. Was there one that you were particularly interested in?
Probably just go from the top.
Yep,
I think.
from the top.
Yeah.
Okay, so this question for both of you. As someone who is taking an SSRI for severe anxiety, do you foresee any chances in the future of psilocybin being used to treat sufferers of this, or the clinical trials being used mainly for terminal ill patients at the moment?
Do you want to touch that? Or?
We both can. There's definitely an interest in creating a trial for treatment-resistant depression or just depression. There is phase 2 trials happening currently in the US and through Europe for phase 2 treating depression with psilocybin. So it's definitely something we'd love to create. I guess it's a matter of a limitation of funding. So,
Yeah.
and with the SSRI, I think Martin can
Yeah,
answer
sure.
that.
So I think the key factor here is that, as I'm sure most of you are aware, SSRIs are taken daily for an extended period of time, sometimes in some cases for intractable anxiety or depression for the rest of one's life. And that's really the huge contrast with psychedelic therapy, which is more often than not a single administration or maybe two in the context of psychotherapy. And the benefits really accrue. They come very quickly, and they have been found to last 6 months or longer in the significant majority of cases. As far as anxiety itself is concerned, that's really going to be interesting to explore, because anxiety and depression can be very closely correlated, of course, but they can also be somewhat separate conditions. And so anxiolytic therapy is one of the options which unfortunately has attendant side effects and the concern about tolerance and eventual habituation or dependence. Interestingly enough, psilocybin has been used successfully in trials to treat OCD, so obsessive compulsive disorder, which is considered to be something of an anxiety-related disorder, I believe. And then another one which has been mentioned to me recently is the potential of psilocybin for treatment of eating disorders as well, which are also considered to be very deep-seated anxiety-related disorders. So I personally would really love to see research take place in Australia. We potentially could lead the world in this, because it's actually a research space that hasn't been explored to any great degree elsewhere. And so I feel that if we can really get things rolling successfully with this initial trial, then further trials are going to be made much more straightforward and accessible. I think we'll have increasing interest from funding partners as well as from researchers in the space and specialist researchers in these particular subfields of mental health. And so I would encourage all of you to participate in the conversation, contribute to the conversation with people you may know in the mental health space, and then perhaps between us we can all bring things forward fairly quickly. What I can say is that the dam wall appears to be sort of bursting a little bit, and there does appear to be some interest already in researching psilocybin for other mental health conditions already, specifically major depressive disorder or straight depression. And so there's another one which I can't tell you about at the moment, but there's certainly potential. I feel there's great interest already in the field. I'm very happy to say that I think we've started to really tread the path, and that will make it much more straightforward for others to enter the field. And what I can also say is that PRISM is in no way trying to be proprietorial or dominate the space. So we feel that it's a significant first step taken, and we encourage all people to participate in research in Australia.
Staying on psilocybin research, someone is interested in the protocol used around the research. Is even outlaid yet? Or?
I can give it to you in a nutshell.
Yeah.
Basically, as many of you may already be aware, very critical to the success of psychedelic psychotherapy are the steps of preparatory therapy, which normally in our case would be a couple of sessions, fairly extended sessions between the participant or the patient and the clinicians, to basically to set the scene for the therapeutic process. Most of these people, particularly people who are at end of life through terminal illness, probably will not be experienced in psychedelic use, and so they will need to be informed of the potential effects, potential side effects and adverse effects, which generally would include some anxiety as the experience is starting and unfolding, but then generally that will be resolved. If it turns out to be anxiety or any other mental health difficulties that cannot be resolved, then it's possible to use rescue medications, but that's generally not preferred. But all of these would be explained to the participant in those preparatory sessions. And the importance of these preparatory sessions is also to establish the therapeutic alliance between the participant and the clinical team. In all cases, we'll have a male-female dyad team, and they'll always be trained clinical psychologists and/or psychiatrists. In each case, we will need to have a qualified medical practitioner who is able to actually formally prescribe and administer the drug. Then the active compound, the psilocybin or placebo session would take place. It would be a full day session starting at 8 in the morning and would go through till perhaps between 4 and 6 in the afternoon. And that would be a sort of a gently guided psychotherapy session, so that it's really the participant doing the healing themselves, him or herself. There would be music through. There'll be music through headphones. There are a couple of interesting enhancements that we're hoping to bring into our clinical trial, which will be very interesting in terms of the music selection and so on. There'd be normally eye shades so that people who are having strongly visual experiences can go through those without major distractions. And then, of course, you may be aware that equally important are the integrative sessions, which would take place after the active session. And those would be, again, discussions between the participant and the therapists to go through the individual's experience and then to try and put those within the context of their own broader experience and hopefully achieve the lasting therapeutic outcomes. So that's sort of it in a nutshell. Ours is it's a placebo-controlled, randomized controlled trial with a crossover design, which means that half of our 30 participants will receive a placebo of niacin or nicotinic acid, same compound, which basically gives quite a sort of a flush to the face and makes people feel that something might be going on, but it doesn't obviously have the psychoactive effects of psilocybin. And then the other half would receive 25 milligrams, which is a pretty solid dose of psilocybin. So they're more or less guaranteed to have a significant psychedelic experience. And then at a point normally around 6 weeks after that initial session of psilocybin placebo, then there's the crossover, so that those people who receive the placebo the first time will receive this psilocybin the second time. They and the therapists won't be aware whether they've had one or the other. And those who receive the psilocybin the first time will get the placebo the second time. And that's it's a tricky, slightly tricky aspect of the trial, but it's really very important for us to do it that way for the integrity of the research.
And 25 milligrams of psilocybin, what does that equate to in grams? Is it around 4?
Probably 3.5 to 4 grams dried of local subaeruginosa.
I'm going to combine two questions here because there's a few people that have asked a similar question, but I suppose it's the other side of the research question. It's the money side. The question, how do we stop big pharma corrupting psychedelic research? And I'll put this one in here too, going back to the synthetic thing that we talked about before, synthetic psilocybin. Somebody's asking, is this a bad thing or a good thing in terms of patenting and the way that medicines can be controlled by business? So thoughts. This is a big topic. It's a topic that's only starting to balloon recently.
I'm champing at the bit with this one. The best way we can keep big pharma out is to demonstrate that psilocybin is the best, most efficacious psychedelic for this, and to basically to suggest that analogues or other psychedelic compounds that could be created or synthesized, invented by pharmaceutical companies, are not as efficacious in the treatment of these mental health conditions. Because psilocybin is it's a natural product. It's derived from a mycological source, fungal source. It can't actually be patented. What can be patented, however, by a company, and it's generally not going to be big pharma for a reason that I'll explain in just a moment. If there's a new method of synthesis which makes the production of psilocybin cheaper or more effective or more efficient, then that process can be patented, but that doesn't exclude other companies, including non-profits, from developing other synthetic techniques. So it's really just protection for the synthetic process at this stage. If the laws finally change so that natural product psilocybin could be used, then there's absolutely no way that could be protected through the IP system. Now, the reason that I alluded to about big pharma not being interested, and this is pretty much the same case for MDMA, in fact almost any psychedelic psychotherapy, is that because psychedelic psychotherapy has been shown to be efficacious after only 1, 2, or maybe 3 administrations. This is really not at all of interest to the big pharmaceutical model, commercial model. Their interest is actually in promoting the daily use of antipsychotics, antidepressants, anxiolytics, so that they can keep charging generally the public health system, but often the private health systems as well, to just keep on dispensing drugs. So I would put it to you that exploring and developing psychedelic psychotherapies is probably the best way to keep big pharma in check as it happens.
And that's also why it's difficult to bring psychedelic medicines to market, because there isn't that big pharma push. It's a much slower process, which is okay. It's probably better to have them out than in.
Yep. One thing I can say is that to bring for Merck or Glaxo, GSK, or one of the global Novartis, or whoever, one of the big pharmaceutical companies, to bring a totally novel drug to market, and this must, I have to say, this includes the very preliminary costs of identifying a target, developing the very early, very small molecules, which then can be developed into more effective, larger molecules, which eventually can be turned into drugs. And then, usually this will include the attrition of hundreds, if not thousands, of other candidate compounds, and then eventually involve the global marketing effort for each of the markets for which a drug is to be commercialized, is in the order of 800,000 to $1 billion US. So these are the realities. This is what a pharmaceutical company budgets to bring a new drug to market. When we're talking about psychedelic psychotherapy, we're talking very, very small beer by comparison. Okay, so just to give you an idea, we're looking at probably in the order of $200,000 to $500,000 absolute tops to go through all of the clinical phase 2 and 3 process to bring something like psilocybin to market. So those are the kind of numbers we are talking about. That's the grim reality that we're living in.
Switching to a slightly... Yeah, yep. We've got about 5 minutes left. But a question here, has there been any research done on derealization disorder? And I haven't heard of this, so maybe you could talk about is there a derealization disorder, and can you talk a bit about it, and what would you recommend as a treatment?
There hasn't been any research into psychedelics to treat depersonalization or derealization disorder. I imagine that would be a difficult one, and probably might require perhaps even a longer treatment regime. Would you say so, Martin?
Yeah. One thing I can say is that in general, unfortunately, at this stage in clinical research, there's a range of broader psychotic-related disorders, and also borderline personality and a couple of these other depersonalization type disorders, with depersonalization, which are explicitly excluded from trials. At this stage, they tend to be just too difficult cases which are too difficult to manage in the therapeutic context, and the likelihood is that the results will be confounded by that underlying mental health condition. So unfortunately at this stage there's not much we can do. So I'm sorry on behalf of the research community about that.
And that's not to say that there might be some positive effect, it's just to say that it's a difficult one to study. So they'll come later.
Final question, and it's important. It's probably a good one to finish on because it's important for everybody. There is a lot of excitement over all of this, and often I see online, spend far too much time looking at these social media comment threads, but a lot of people will be recommending to their friends or to somebody, some random stranger on the internet, oh, take this for, you've got depression, just go take some mushrooms. So the question is, what sort of risk is attached to recommending self-trials to other people, side effects related to other mental health conditions that they might have? Like, is it a good idea? What should people be doing if a friend's asking to be pointed in a right direction, I guess?
Well, I think a first point is if somebody has a mental health condition, they should be seeing, well, it's ideal to be seeing a psychologist or a psychotherapist regularly. I don't think that friends, even well-meaning friends, should act as a primary caregiver in these circumstances. And there are psychologists who are open to discussing concepts around preparation and integration. Obviously, they can't give psychedelic therapy, but there are quite a few psychologists out there willing to do the aftermath talks and the preparation talks. So seeking out somebody who, with an open mind, if this person's going to be doing it anyway, it's something to consider. But that's a tricky one.
Yeah.
And always needs caution.
Yeah, and certainly that the comorbid risks of, as I mentioned before, psychotic type mental health conditions potentially could be exacerbated by the use of psychedelics, even just a single experience. So I don't know who or how many people in this audience might have had contact with people who have had very difficult experiences that have led to ongoing mental health conditions, but anybody who has, I'm sure they'd agree with me that it's generally a situation that we would prefer to avoid. And so this is really the reason that that careful screening and at least awareness on the part of potential self-medicators of the risks of underlying mental health conditions should be taken into account.
Again, we have a stall in the market area where you can go and continue having conversations with people from APS and from SSDP about their campaign, Be Heard Not Harmed. You can also hear more about that campaign tomorrow, about this time in the Cocoon, I think from 3:45, so a little bit earlier. You've heard from Martin Williams from PRISM, Psychedelic Research in Science and Medicine. Thank you. A round of applause. And Melissa Warner from Mind Medicine Australia, who again are launching with an event with Professor David Nutt on Wednesday, February 13th. It's in Melbourne at the University of Melbourne, the Carrillo Ganter Theatre, from 5:30 p.m. onwards. Full price $35, students at $25. The bookings, events.humanitix.com.au. But
I actually have quite a number of these pamphlets. If you want to take one, just come up maybe onto the side and I can give you one. So,
and you don't have to remember it.
Then yes.
And please continue the conversations. Continue talking about these things among people that might be vaguely interested. If they're not that interested, maybe talk their ear off a little bit. If you're that kind of person, do it. Go and talk to the people. That's what will make things change. It's a growing understanding. It's going to take a little while, but it's going places.
Thanks again for coming along, everybody.
Thank you.
Great.